My favorite first watches of 2024. The films that I saw for the very first time that were not released in 2024. That is the idea. And yes, the idea did in fact come from Karsten. And you can see his video linked down in the description box below. It's a damn good list. And I dare say that if you were to combine both of our lists together, you've got yourself a damn fine cinematic time. Now, 2024 was an interesting year for me from a film perspective, and I'm going to explain it a little bit more in a different video, but essentially, I gave up on streaming entirely, and I have now moved entirely to physical media, either renting or buying, and this list kind of reflects that. It is what I was able to find in my local video store. And in the past, I was also relying on the films being programmed at TIFF or at the Review Cinema or one of the many different repertory theaters that we have in Toronto. But in this list of 16 films, 10 of which I'm going to be talking about a little bit more in depth, only I think 3 of them were seen in theaters. So this marks a very different time in my film watching journey. Things are changing and it's exciting, and I think I'm seeing better films because of it. So we're going to start things off rapid fire with 6 films. These are going to be the honorable mentions of the list, but I have disguised them in some sort of weird award format that no one cares about. So to start things off, we've got the best revenge film, which is Rebels of the Neon God by Xia Minglang. Next is the best French accent in a film, which of course must go to Burt Lancaster in The Train. If you have seen that film, you know that I am being very sarcastic. Next, the ever-popular Biggest Asshole in Cinema award going to that one jerk in Dry Summer, the Turkish film from 1963, where there is a villain whose face is so punchable. I don't think there has been someone in cinema who has been more punchable than this man. Absolute deplorable asshole piece of shit. Next is everyone's most favorite category, the movie where Nazis die really good. And that, of course, went to Army of Shadows. Boy, did the Nazis die good in that movie. Next we have the I'm Not Crying, You're Crying award, which went to Satoshi Kon's Tokyo Godfathers. There were many an onion being cut when that film was watched. I assume by other people who actually cry. Not me, though. I'm too cool for that. And finally, we have the award for the most Hitchcock-ass film I've ever seen, Dressed to Kill by Brian De Palma from 1980. Way to go, Brian. First film on the list is Violent Panic: The Big Crash, the 1976 film directed by Kinji Fukasaku. And you probably know him better as the director of Battle Royale. And what you may not know about him is that he actually started directing films in like the 60s, maybe even the late 50s. I probably should have looked that up. But this film operates a little bit differently than Battle Royale in that it is chaos. It is pure vehicular chaos. Eventually. See, the basic story of this film is that there's a bank robber, and he gets a real good score, a lot of money, you know what I'm saying? And then everyone in his life who is also a scumbag tries to take that money from him. And this is essentially the story that we get for the first 2/3 of the film. And because of the way this guy operates, he's always just going everywhere, being chased in all different types of ways, he starts bringing people into his orbit, kind of like a black hole. And when we get to this final third of the film, the black hole has sucked so many people into it that we get a kind of Blues Brothers-esque final chase sequence that turns into a demolition derby. And I can't believe that no one was killed during the making of this film. It's astonishing. It goes so hard in that final third that it needs to be seen to be believed. And in fact, I just mentioned Blues Brothers, and I, after watching this film, Violent Panic, had to look up which film came out first, and it turns out it was Violent Panic. So I think that the people who made Blues Brothers were looking at this film and saying, yeah, let's do something like this. If you love car violence, you should absolutely check this film out. And I believe you can stream it on the Film Movement Classic streaming service. So yeah, you can check it out there. This is not sponsored, by the way. Next up, we have Millennium Actress by Satoshi Kon, the 2001 film that comes after Perfect Blue, but before Tokyo Godfathers. And this was a great year for Satoshi Kon for me. I had already had The Bread of his filmography, and now I was getting to the delicious filling of the Satoshi Kon sandwich. Now, it goes without saying that a Satoshi Kon film is going to have beautiful animation, and I don't really feel a need to try to describe that to you. You could probably just look at any single film cell from this film and be like, oh yeah, this looks incredible, and you would be right. The thing, though, that I really latched on here, and what put it above Tokyo Godfathers in my estimation, is the way that this film plays with history, narrative, memory, and blurring the lines between each. I love stuff like that. It is a personal preoccupation of mine. If you ever need a reason as to why I love Blade Runner the most out of anything, it's because of how it deals with memory and identity and the interweaving of those things. I love that. It's the best thing ever. And in Millennium Actress, we get a lot of that same kind of stuff. Here, it's sort of like a documentary where an actress is recounting her life, but is also using the plot lines from the various films that she has been in order to help recount those moments in her life. And only really the documentarian understands this. And they have this wonderful back and forth where they are both reliving everything that they have both experienced, although from different perspectives. And what is real, what is not real, what is made up kind of doesn't matter, because whenever you do tell a story, when you recount something from memory, it's often distorted, it's often a bit different, and the events and the culture that surrounds us at that time can influence how we remember things, what we deem as being most important. And this was just a brilliant way of showing that. I give Satoshi Kon so much credit for being able to weave these multiple storylines, falsehoods, memories, whatever together, and you still end up with this wonderful emotional impact and release at the end of the film. The fact that there may have been some made-ups up here, or you don't really know what's real and what's not, doesn't matter, because it's the emotional impact of the telling that is most important. It's a fantastic piece, and if Perfect Blue didn't exist, I would probably say this is my favorite film of his, but Perfect Blue does exist, so sorry, Millennium Actress. Next on the list is Green Fish, the very first film by the person who I think might be the best film director who's alive right now, Lee Chang-dong. And I am going to put a video together in the future where I make this case, where Lee Chang-dong is number one in the world. The man is so good and his hit rate is so high that it needs to be talked about and perhaps even be shouted from the rooftops. Incredible stuff. But Green Fish is where he started off. And I think the best way to maybe describe this, especially to Western audiences, is that it's a Korean Goodfellas, kind of. It tells the story of a guy who desperately wanted to get into the mafia, gets into the mafia, and then realizes that being in the mafia is not everything that it's cracked up to be. Lee Chang-dong's work often operates as a critique of what's going on in modern-day Korean society. And Green Fish, while also a critique, I find it's not as pointed as a film like Poetry or even Burning, the film that you probably know Lee Chang-dong for the most. That said, it's very obvious in this film that there is a progression happening inside Korean society at the time. This film came out in 1997, and there is a kind of creep of progress, of industrialization, of urbanization that is going on in the background here. And when you get to the end of the film, it's very clear who benefits the most from that urbanization, from that progress. It's not the working class people who are trying their best. It's the gangsters who figure out how to game the system to their advantage. And I think that Lee Chae-dong is not being especially cute or nuanced with this take. I do think what is most fascinating about this film is the journey of the lead character. I'm not going to get into spoiler territory, don't worry, but it operates a little bit differently than the lead character in Goodfellas. You're not going to walk away from this film thinking to yourself, oh man, I wish I could have been part of a mafia at some point in my life. It's not that kind of film. There's no glamour here. It's all just bad news. It's also a fun watch because it's Song Kang-ho's very first film. You'll recognize him from his roles in Parasite and a bunch of other Bong Joon-ho films. So if you're a big fan of his, you should go watch this one. And finally, I just want to say that as a debut film, this is Lee Chang-dong's very first film. This is a very assured debut. He knows what he's doing. He knows how he wants to accomplish it. He knows how he wants the film to look at the end of it. This is a very confident debut, and it is emblematic of what Lee Chang-dong would eventually do in his career. It's not up to the standard of some of his later films, but to come out of the gates with a film like this is pretty stunning. Pretty astonishing, actually. Next film is Elevator to the Gallows, one of the very few films on this list that I actually saw on a streaming service. I watched it live on the Criterion channel, and there may be a video about that coming soon in the future if I ever finish it. So keep an eye out for that. Subscribe and stuff. This film came out in 1958, and I think there's a real benefit to that. For those of you who aren't up on your film history, it was in 1959 when Truffaut came out with The 400 Blows, and then in 1960 when Godard came out with Breathless, and this was when the French New Wave really took off and took over French cinema for the next decade or so. So Elevator to the Gallows coming out the year before means that it's not entrenched in all of the different signifiers and things that the French New Wave were really interested in. This is more of a typical Hollywood crime thriller, but with that sort of effortless, cool Frenchness to it. A lot of cigarettes were definitely smoked in the making of this film, I'll put it that way. Now, the idea in this film is that you got 3 different plot lines, all of which stem from a single crime that starts at the beginning of the film. And as these different plot lines spread out and move away from each other, you can see as the viewer how they may come back into cross one another, how they may overlap later on in the film. So the delicate balancing act happening here is having these different plot lines roll out, showing the viewer information in little bits and pieces here and here and here, giving us a kind of roadmap as to how we're eventually going to come back together, but still maintaining the tension that must exist within each of these 3 plot lines in order to keep the audience engaged, in order to keep the me engaged, the TJ engaged, and the TJ was engaged. Once again, not going to get into the story beyond that. I will just say that this film is propulsive. It does draw you in, and it just looks great as well. Wonderful black and white photography. It does kind of play in that space of trying to show the modernization of France at that point, at the end of the 1950s and sort of that post-war era of France. And everything has this kind of new, shiny feel to it, but still feels a little bit inauthentic, like maybe we've been doing things a little bit incorrectly. Maybe we haven't exactly committed to a better way of living. And I think what the characters go through is perhaps emblematic of that. Basically what I'm going to try to get across to you, and I probably didn't explain this properly enough, but if you like Memento, you're probably going to like this. I think you're going to like the way that the information is controlled and how, as a viewer, you become more and more surprised as the film goes on until you get that final wonderful finale where everything just ties together and you're like, ah, yeah, that was real good. Next film up is Goodbye Dragon Inn by Xiaiming Lang. I'm sorry, I know I pronounced that incorrectly, but I'm trying my best. Now, for those of you among you who know who this person is, you will know that Rebels of the Neon God is another film that he directed, and it was already in the honorable mentions. Well, guess what? This isn't the only CI film in this entire list. I watched a lot of his stuff this year. But this film is kind of fascinating because it focuses on a movie theater in Taiwan that is playing the classic Taiwanese martial arts film Dragon Inn on the theater's last day of operation. And in classic Xiai style, the film rolls out very slowly with lots of long takes, and we really just experience this movie theater through the people who are inside of it. The proprietor, we follow her around. There are a couple of different patrons that we follow around as well. And this whole time, as we're weaving in and out of the theater, through the concessions, into the bathrooms, into the backstage areas, you can kind of hear or feel or understand that that film, Dragon Inn, is playing in the background. And it creates this wonderful little mesh where we always have that one solid foundational thing to come back to, even though we are in this kind of unmoored, soon-to-be liminal space that is going to disappear entirely. And I think what's really at play here is this is a sort of eulogy or a funeral for what was a place where community could gather and be built. And that's one of the aspects about the film that I kind of enjoy the most, that you see the communities that are left, small as they may be, and for what reason the theater was important to them. And I should probably stress at this point, this is not a documentary. This is a fiction film, but this film was made in a movie theater that was likely about to close down or was going to close down in the very near future. Now, the best description I've found for this film and how it kind of leaves you and maybe stays in your head actually came from A.O. Scott, who was writing for the New York Times. And he said that the film had a kind of quiet, cumulative magic that is hard to identify. And I love that, because if you're watching the film and you're perhaps not used to slow cinema and the way that it operates, you may find yourself frustrated by this movie at the pace being so slow. But then, at least for me personally, who's not frustrated by slow cinema, I found that after the film was over, and even now to this day, I think I watched the film months ago, at least 6 months ago, there are images still in my head from this film. It lingers, it stays with you, and it builds up and it builds up and it builds up, and there's not really a payoff. It's about ends. This movie is about things ending, and so when Dragon Inn the film finishes, the movie Goodbye Dragon Inn also finishes. The marquee goes out, the lights get turned off, and that is that. What you end up cumulatively at the end of it is just so much beautiful imagery that will stay in your mind. It definitely stayed in mine and likely will for a very long time. Now, if you've never tried slow cinema, you're not really sure what I'm talking about, I don't think this is the first film you should try, but I do have a suggestion for what could be the first one, but that's going to be coming a couple of films down the line. Next on the list, we have The Wailing by Na Hong Jin. This is another Korean film. I think I watched a lot of Korean films this year, and this one I had always heard about. I am someone who will go onto Amazon occasionally and see what 4K Blu-rays are for sale, and The Wailing is always on sale for like $16, but I never tried to purchase it because I didn't really know what it was, and I didn't really know why it had the reputation that it had. Because it's a Korean horror movie, I often thought, oh, it's probably something like I Saw the Devil. And weirdly, if you were to only know I Saw the Devil based on the title, you'd be kind of right, although I do think they are somewhat different films. I'm so happy and so glad that I finally checked this film out. It is an incredible horror film, an absolutely incredible horror/thriller film. And I'm not going to tell you a goddamn thing about the plot. You need to go in as cold as possible. But one thing I do want to say to you, for the person who hasn't seen it and who's about to try it, give it 45 minutes, because this movie starts off so goddamn goofy, I almost couldn't believe it. I thought I was watching a parody film of like zombie films or something like that. So give it time. Once it hits its stride and the tone shifts into what I would say is a more serious territory, then you're in for a GD ride. A good ride. Now, I'm not going to talk about the narrative, like I said, but I do need to say that one of the reasons why I think this film is so effective is how the narrative kind of swirls and spins. And we're a little bit unmoored. We never really know who to believe and who to trust until finally at the very end of the film, the protagonist must make a decision. And as a viewer, what surprised me and caught my attention the most is that I wasn't sure what decision they should make. And usually at this point in the film, the viewer has maybe seen something that the main character hasn't. And so we are able to push or want the main character to go a certain way. But I was just as confused and confounded as he was. And this is not an issue with the storytelling. This is directly because of how the story is told. This guy is all twisted up, has no idea what's going on, and is struggling to understand forces well beyond his comprehension. And so are we. And it's wonderful. I don't remember a film having me on the edge of my seat like this. And it's all down to narrative construction and how information is relayed to the viewer. Like, it's brilliant stuff. It's brilliant writing. I also just want to briefly take this moment to let you know that the director's first film, The Chaser, is also worth checking out if you're into like serial killer movies at all. You're gonna love it. If you have 7 in your top 4, you find The Chaser and you find it right goddamn now. It's gonna be a little bit hard to find, but it'll be worth it. Trust me. Next on the list, oh, you know it's another slow cinema film. It is Vive L'Amour from Tsai Ming-liang again. And yeah, this is the best CI film that I saw in 2024. It's also the first one, and it kind of came out of nowhere. I was just walking through my local public library looking at the DVD selection, and I saw this one case kind of standing out. It's a bright yellow case. It's very hard to miss. And so I brought it home with me. I chucked it in the old 4K Blu-ray player, and I just had this film roll out in front of me over the course of the next 90 minutes to 2 hours. And I couldn't really believe what I was seeing. It was not my first experience with slow cinema, but this was maybe the one where I desperately wanted to know what was going on with these characters and how their paths were going to criss and cross throughout the entirety of the film. This film, like Rebels of the Neon God, focuses on a trio of people living in Taiwan, and it actually features a couple of the same performers from Rebels of the Neon God, which I thought was pretty cool. However, the difference here is that the overall vibe of Vive L'Amour is depressing and horny. The characters themselves are searching for connections in this bustling city, but can only ever find fleeting moments of sexual release in liminal spaces. If you were to throw a little bit of crime in here, it would essentially be a slow cinema noir, and that's something that, now that I've said it out loud, I really want to see. Now, since this is such a depressing and horny film, you have to imagine that the title, which translates to Long Live Love, is almost sarcastic given the alienation experienced by the characters against the backdrop of this expansive urban development. This is a lonely film, and one that I think accurately depicts the way that we are living right now. People have become alienated from each other. We live in these giant, expansive cities, yet have trouble finding connections. We are losing communities. We are losing third places in which to meet people. And in this film, at least, the way that it goes about showing people trying to create these connections comes down to that of somewhat empty and hollow sexual experiences. And in the end, at least in terms of how this film depicts it, it shows that once that is achieved, once you have gotten there, if you don't have anything else, you don't have anything. And the film is beautiful, weirdly, because of that. You are often at odds with the film. It looks great, but it is so sad. And I loved it. I loved it to death. An incredible, incredible film. And this was the film that had me going down this path of watching more CI films. And I'm gonna watch more. There's nothing you can do to stop me. Next up is the film Bona by Lino Brocka. This is a 1980 film from the Philippines, and it's probably the film that I'm going to nominate at the Cinemateq Film Awards for Best Restoration. It's an absolutely stunning restoration that needs to be seen to be believed. And it's currently like on tour right now. It's going around to a bunch of different cities in Canada and the United States. So if you see it playing at your local theater, you gotta go. You gotta go check it out. The narrative follows Bona, a young woman who has fallen in love with a struggling supporting actor in the Filipino film industry. She leaves her own home where she's expected to be a maid, and she goes and lives with this guy where she becomes his maid, essentially. The relationship between the two becomes more complicated as the story continues, until there is, at the end of the film, let's call it a falling out. Narratively, the film is obviously playing with the idea of parasocial relationships and the way in which famous people, and even semi-famous people, can control and manipulate people who adore them. For that reason alone, I would love to see more content creators commenting on this film. I think they're going to be seeing things from the perspective of their audience for the first time. Not to suggest that all content creators are like kind of shitty and treat their audience poorly. I know there's a lot of creators out there who treat their audience really, really well. But I think that maybe for some of those who are a tad more exploitative towards their audiences might see things a bit differently if they were to see this film. Beyond the narrative, I loved the formal techniques at play in this film, especially how the sound editing takes on a kind of film editing style of juxtaposing sounds in order to create meaning. You will especially see this in early parts of the film, but it kind of happens all throughout. And it's actually, I think, a little difficult to describe, but when I say juxtaposition, I mean that it is placing one sound next to another sound and then asking you as the audience to create meaning based on that comparison of sounds. Very similar to film editing. In fact, that's what film editing is. It's creating meaning with juxtaposition. And I just kind of love to see this happening with sound, and I kind of want to see it more now. It's not something you see very often. And yeah, performances are great. Cinematography is fantastic. Pretty much you have no reason to not see this film other than it may be difficult to see. So as I said, if it's playing in your hometown, go check it out. Beyond that, I think Canny releasing a Vinegar Syndrome like sub-label, they are going to be releasing it on Blu-ray at some point. So keep an eye out for that as well. Love me some Canny releasing, also not sponsored. Next on the list, oh, it's time to talk about Tiger Cage, baby. Fucking Tiger Cage, the film by Yuen-Woo Ping, who you may recognize as the action choreographer for The Matrix. Yeah. He directed a whole-ass Hong Kong action film in the late 80s, and you better believe that this movie was designed from the ground up to knock your socks off, steal your socks, light your socks on fire, and then slap you in the face for having ever thought that your socks were actually your socks and not belong to the film itself. Does any of that make sense? No. But what you just saw, the mania that I just displayed, perfectly shows how this film will make you feel by the end of it. It is cinema cocaine. It will get you high. It's nuts. It's so fucking crazy. God, it's such a good movie. Now, 2024 was definitely the year where I went all in on Hong Kong action films. I have seen many, I have purchased many, and I'm just going to keep watching more and more and more of them because they're so much fun. And this film, Tiger Cage, it's probably the best showcase of everything that I love about Hong Kong action films, especially from the late 80s. This movie slots more into the John Woo hard-boiled style of gunfight ballet rather than, say, the classic Jackie Chan style of beat 'em up. But it doubles down on the grit and the goofiness of those gung fu style films in equal measure. This film will have you chuckling, and it will have you gripping onto whoever is around you, or I guess a seat if you're watching it by yourself, and you're not going to want to let go. You're not going to be able to let go. It is a GD roller coaster. Not only that, it's lean, baby. It's a tight 90. You could probably argue that a few of the comedic scenes could have been removed, but I would counter argue with you that we really needed those scenes to build up some of the character relationships between the people in it. And unlike a lot of other Hong Kong action films, especially the Jackie Chan variety, people die in this movie. Good guys die, bad guys die. Like, this shit is serious and awesome. And I know I haven't really told you anything about the narrative because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. Bad guys do some bad things. The cops are like, hey, we better stop that from happening. And there you go. There's your narrative. We're not reinventing the bicycle on this one, ladies and gentlemen, but we are punching you in the face continuously, and you love it. You love it. I'm hoping that my enthusiasm is enough to convince you to go track this film down, but I mean, it's just a staggering action film, and I desperately need more people to see it, to know about it, to talk about it. This could be one of the best Hong Kong action films that ever came out of Hong Kong, ever. I'm deadly serious. Go watch it. And now we find ourselves at the top spot. My favorite film that I watched for the very first time, not made in 2024. Of course, that video is coming later. And what could top Tiger Cage? What could be better than the film that I just described to you? And the answer to that is maybe the best melodrama ever, which is Douglas Sirk's Written on the Wind. And not only do I think that this is the best melodrama ever made, but it's perhaps the genesis point for all modern soap operas and reality TV that followed. You may see that as a good thing or a bad thing, but it should at least give you an idea of what you are going to see in this film. Visually, it is lush, it is bright, it is bold, but it is also artificial, and it doesn't try to hide its artifice. It wants you to see the artifice of its own creation. And I don't mean this as in everything looks bad. Everything just looks like it came out of a Hollywood studio turned up to 11. And while it's doing this, while it is showing you how artificial and beautiful it looks, it is hitting you with gut-wrenching scene after gut-wrenching scene. Oh my God. And then probably the biggest standout of the whole thing, the performances. Top to bottom, front to back. Incredible performances. You've got supporting actors Robert Stack, yes, from Unsolved Mysteries, and Dorothy Malone doing personal bests for each of them in this film. Dorothy Malone won a GD Oscar for this role. Incredible. Lauren Bacall is also here, and her character is kind of recalling the coolness of her past characters while situating those same characters in a family of amoral misfits. And to see the interaction between the cool Lauren Bacall and what would end up being her family through marriage in this film, it's wild because it breaks her down. It destroys her. Lauren Bacall, the queen of cool in the 40s, and here she is falling apart because she can't understand or be within this family. God, they're nuts. And then at the center of this whole thing, you've got Rock Hudson, one of my favorite actors of the classic Hollywood period. The man just rules. I love him to death. And Rock Hudson really operates as the anchor in this film on multiple different fronts. He's the emotional anchor, I think, for the audience. He's the emotional anchor for many of the different characters in the film. And the plot really revolves around him and his interactions with the family that he is not a part of, but definitely a part of. And it's around this film that we find a swirling kind of restrained chaos that's always threatening to break through, to bust through, to spill out over the edges, and to absolutely envelop all involved in this narrative. And then it does. The chaos becomes unrestrained, and it just flows, and it destroys. And it does this in what I think is maybe one of the best climactic scenes in film history. In this final scene, the mix of music and editing creates a cacophony of disaster that will leave you breathless and one, maybe two, maybe all of the characters just dead. You're gonna have to watch it to find out. The last thing I'll say about this film is that I think it offers a rare opportunity to get people into old Hollywood cinema. If you have a person in your life who often says, oh, I can never get into old Hollywood cinema, it's just too different for me. It's not modern or anything like that. But then they can go off and watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians for 12 hours. I think if you were to show them this film, they would be able to see how the DNA for what they enjoy so much right now was kind of developed here. And that can be a really great springboard into showing them other fantastic films from this period, especially other Douglas Sirk films. You gotta watch all the Douglas Sirk films from this period, especially the ones with Rock Hudson. They do great things together. So in conclusion, Written on the Wind, a stunning, stunning film that you must watch, you must track down. I think it's on Criterion, so it shouldn't be that hard to find, but you must watch this film. Mwah. Beautiful, wonderful, fantastic. And there is my list of my most favoritist first watches of 2024. But now I want to know, what were your most favoritist first watches of 2024?